Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Society of Antiquaries of London. Given the theme of tonight's talk, I thought I'd just introduce you to some of our own royal collection. Over here we have Anglo-Saxon kings. They're unnamed apart from this one, Athelstan, and they come from Eltham Palace. They lined the Great Hall, but Eltham Palace burnt down and somebody managed to salvage some of these pieces. They're very rare survivors. And over here, we have a collection. There's a fellow called Thomas Kerridge, 200 years ago. He's actually a really good artist as well, who gifted these pieces. You have the Plantagenets and the Tudors, and of course, this fantastic piece, painting of Mary by Hans Ewert, and you have the European dukes and monarchs. And then there's a couple over there of Edward IV and Richard III. He salvaged them from sale rooms up and down the country. And in the council room, where the drinks are served, you'll see Henry V, you'll see Henry VII. There's a lovely portrait of Henry VIII and a lady we think is Jane Seymour. So that's our portraits. And in front of them is some artwork, two fantastic artists who joined the Society as affiliate members 12 months ago. And for that, we have to thank the London Art Week. They held an event here and they came along. So I must just tell you about Adam and Dant Llywelyn Hall, because I think there'll be an opportunity to talk about their paintings as part of the presentation. So Adam Dant, sitting in front of me here, is a Jerwood Drawing prize-winning artist. He was the official artist for the 2015 general election, and he's produced commissioned work for Queen Elizabeth II's Jubilee, Christie's 250th anniversary, Christopher Wren's tercentenary in 2023, and the 900th anniversary of St. Bartholomew's. His work has been exhibited all over the world, including New York's Museum of Modern Art, the V&A, the Tate, the RA, and of course, the Society of Antiquaries of London. And Dan Llywelyn Hall is exhibited throughout the UK, and including the National Portrait Gallery. I think he was the youngest artist to be officially commissioned by the Queen to paint a portrait. He was artist in residence at the Cannes Film Festival, and for the 75th anniversary of the Dam Busters raid, he painted all 133 airmen that took part in the raid. So, as part of this, and in partnership with URS Linley Fine Arts, we put on this exhibition to draw the public into our buildings. But these guys are going to auction off their work to help the society digitize our prints and drawings collections. We have a record of about 25,000 sketches, watercolors, paintings, and prints that relate to monuments, antiquities, topography, right across the British Isles. Just to give you an example of that, outside we had an apprenticed artist engraver who worked for the Society for 7 years by the name of William Blake. So those prints and drawings contain a treasure trove, but people don't get access to it. So part of the RAIN project is to auction off this stuff and to employ a cataloger to make that stuff accessible. Now, for our main event, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our presentation on the royal portrait, and our speaker will also ask our artists some questions at the end of the evening. Please welcome Andrew Graham Dixon. Andrew is one of the leading art critics and presenters in television today. He's presented numerous landmark series on art for the BBC and other independents. He's a long history of public service in the field of visual art, and he's currently a member of the Blue Plaque panel, and he's currently writing a book about Vermeer. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to Andrew Graham Dixon.
Thank you very much. I see this as the warm-up act for you to hear from the artists whose work is surrounding us about what they've created in this fascinatingly unexpected encounter of the modern and the very old, indeed the antiquarian. I'm a great fan of antiquarians from Walpole onwards. But I thought perhaps I could begin by just sharing some reflections about this strange genre, the royal portrait. It's a strange occupation, being a king or a queen. I'm currently embedded in the Dutch Golden Age, so I'm writing this book about Vermeer. And the culture that produced Vermeer was profoundly hostile to the notion of a monarchy. It's probably the most anti-monarchical society before that of the French Revolution. Peter de la Court, who was the brilliant industrialist, wise merchant, political philosopher of the Dutch Republic, fascinating man, virtually the first political theorist to advance the possibility of international peace as a way of being. The idea that you could have peace throughout Europe was regarded as utterly mad by everyone else. But he said, no, I think it could be so if we didn't have kings. Because the trouble is, kings are autocratic, they hate freedom of expression, they don't like universities, they don't like learning, they don't like the subjects to be too well educated. They restrict trade, they restrict people's ability to rise up any kind of social hierarchy that they themselves haven't dictated. They like to control everything. But the worst problem with kings is that they can only keep the score in one way. This also applies to tyrants. I mean, he called kings and tyrants, same thing. So he's basically talking about Putin. They only keep the score in one way, which is conquest of territory. So given that this is the downside, how do you put, I suppose the problem for the portraitist has always been, I suppose, if you're seeing it through Peter de la Court's eyes, how to disguise all that. How to disguise all that tyranny and unfairness and injustice and social inequality and warlikeness. How to disguise all that and make it seem somehow as if it's the status quo, as if it's what should be, as if it's what's normal. You could say that you're being Peter de la Court, that's the job of the royal portraitist. If you're a monarchist, you'd say that, of course, the job of the royal portraitist is to show the glory and the magnificence of the one individual who's been anointed by God to rule all the rest of us and who can do no wrong. How do you convey the fact that this person can do no wrong? And the other thing about the royal portrait is, I suppose it's sort of often overlooked, in the history of Western art, portraiture itself is only a relatively late invention, in the sense that it arises in about 1460. Maybe a little bit earlier in the case of donor portraits. It's still, it's there in donor portraits, in altarpieces and on the walls of Italian churches and indeed churches in the Low Countries. But as independent, freestanding, here's a man or a woman, here's a man and his wife and so on, the portrait starts in about 1460, 1470. Early exponents of it are all northern. And then when you look at the other painters in the Mediterranean who are painting portraits, they are all looking at northern prototypes. So Botticelli, for example, he's doing an Italian version of a northern idea. How do you make this new medium sort of numinous and king-like? I'm going to start with an example that's probably not very well known. This is it's an interesting one, because it wasn't until fairly recently, and possibly something to do with me even very mildly, has been reattributed. It was always thought to be by Lorenzo Maitani, who is known to have visited Henry VII on a kind of patronage whipping up tour to Britain, try and get some work for his workshop here. And this is a surviving object from that. And you think, well, who would Maitani have been painting? I mean, have been sculpting at that time? This is this amazing kind of, I don't know if you know his work, it's fantastic. Polychrome statuary, one of the great artists of this sort of Madame Tussauds style of realism that's never been taken that seriously by art historians from Kenneth Clark onwards, because it's not quite tasteful. too highly realistic, but it's fan-bloody-tastic. And this is an example of it being applied, I think, to royal portraiture. I think this is Henry VIII as a young boy. And if Maitani's wanting to impress Henry VII, who's he going to depict? You know, the scullery boy? No. I mean, it's, you know, we think, and I think the Royal Collection agreed that they think this really creepy, frightening little boy. I mean, that's exactly what you think Henry VIII would have looked like, isn't it? It's somehow slightly terrifying. It's a little bit like the beginning of The Exorcist. So not quite that bad, but you know what I mean. Anyway, so that's Maitani, who never did ultimately get the commission from Henry VII, because well, anyway, it's another story. Pietro Torrigiano had his nose broken by Michelangelo on the steps of the Carmine and was hounded out of Florence by Medici hitmen. So he ended up coming to England and creating the greatest sculpture in Westminster Abbey, the Torrigiano tomb. But it could have been Maitani. So I haven't put in the famous cartoon of Henry VIII, which you can currently see at the National Portrait Gallery. I put in this because that was destroyed in the Whitehall fire. So this is it's the most ambitious dynastic portrait ever created. And this is a fragment of it as reimagined by a workshop artist for Holbein, which does survive, and it's in Petworth House, but it gives you, as it were, Henry VIII as he would have been painted by Holbein in full colour. And it gives you some sense of what's going on. Now, what is going on at the level of portraiture is the royal portrait is the first full-length portrait. So in other words, it's a man standing before you, all of him before you, head to toe, and he's life-size. So he's almost like he's more like the Maitani than you might think. Because in a sense, this is a painting that aspires to the condition of a polychrome sculpture. And there's a good reason for that, because the association of a full-length form carved, three-dimensionally realized as this is, when people saw that in the early 16th century, they thought, a god. It's a god. Full-length statue must be a god. And of course, yes, that's what the painting is saying. This is a kind of god. He's the god of the Tudor dynasty. And he looks at full frontal, what does that remind you of? This is the convention of the royal portrait. It's not the convention of any other kind of portrait. The full face, bang, straight onto you. Where does that come from? The Ghent altarpiece. God, full face. Napoleon nixed this, exactly this pretty much, by getting Ingres to paint him, I think, like one of the French critics said, like a mad Japaniste Jan van Eyck. He has painted Napoleon as a Flemish god, complete with the Carolingian bees. So Napoleon borrowed the Henry VIII image, but it didn't, I mean, the thing that makes this very Tudor, and the thing, if you see the Maitani as a little seed, it's a little seed, it's a little future king, it's going to grow into a future king. Well, all the rest of the seeds are inside that codpiece, which is this huge, thrustingly massive phallic statement about the fact that he is going to fuck his way to the most fantastic dynasty in the history of kingship, which never happened. And that's the wonderful irony, a beautiful irony of Henry VIII's sort of massive pose here, is that actually the seed of all this would be a girl, and she'd be by far the most effective monarch that this country's ever seen, until perhaps the other girl, lady, woman who we've just had. Queens outscore kings massively in British history. I mean, they're all 10 out of 10, the queens, whereas the kings are most definitely not. And here she is. This very clever, again, you know, as evil and well, I shouldn't say quite evil, but you know what I mean. God blimey, you wouldn't want to get on the wrong side of her. And you probably wouldn't even know if you had or why you had, and you'd just be in the tower and that was it, you know. I married somebody that I loved. Well, that means you didn't love me, but no one's allowed to marry you. It doesn't matter to the tower. You're one of my admirers. You don't marry someone else. You should know that. How? How should I know that? I don't know. You should be able to read the runes. Anyway, very clever. If you're an art historian, of course, you can't really like these people. If you're an antiquarian, you particularly hate these people, if you're true to yourself, because between them, Henry VIII and Elizabeth I were responsible for the destruction of approximately 900,000 works of art. Because between 1532 and 1590, 99.9% of all art in Britain was destroyed by the Nazis of the Church of England, who managed to get in under the power of these people. And they destroyed everything, absolutely everything. I mean, Lawrence Stone, brilliant historian of medieval art, said that the task of the medieval historian in Britain is to reconstruct the entire skeleton of a brontosaurus from half a tooth and a fossilized toenail, because that's all we've got. So, for example, Italian people coming to Britain in the 1520s would write back to their Medici friends saying, "My God, the art in Britain, it's incredible. You've never seen anything like it." And they're so passionate. And the blood in their statues of the crucifixion is so red. It's not like our cold, passionless Italian blood. It's English blood. It's passionate. They're crazy. They're mad. They crawl about on their knees until their knees are bleeding. So they're looking at their bleeding statues with bleeding knees. They're mad. They are so in love with art, these British. It's everywhere. Every inch of their cathedrals is creeping. Exeter Cathedral, 70-foot high statue of Jesus Christ carved from an entire oak tree, which it cost the entire budget of Exeter for 3 years. It would cost them that money to gild the cross. Gone, 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 all gone, everything gone, smashed, dead, gone. And then we get her. Brilliant, genius, evil spider at the center of the monarch web. What's she done here? She's stolen it all. It's like 900,000 religious images, and they're no longer there, and all of their power, all of their magic, all of everything has gone to her. So you don't look at the Virgin Mary anymore, you look at the Virgin Queen. You don't look at the miracle performed by Francis of Assisi or Thomas of Becket. The shrines have all been smashed too. You look at the miracle of the Armada. Through her intervention, through her hotline to God. There's a telephone inside that globe. She pulls it out. God, we need to defeat the Spanish. Boom, fantastic. That's what she can do. The power of the image. There she goes. Marcus Geerarts the Elder. Marcus Geerarts the Elder, living in the borough of Shoreditch, having fled from the Catholic persecution of the Spanish Habsburgs in the Low Countries, one of the 4 great trans-European migrations, 2 of which are caused by the 80 Years' War between Spain and the Netherlands. 60,000 Netherlanders flee from the Council of Blood of the Duke of Alba, and they come here to practice their Protestant faith. He's 6 when he arrives, and then he becomes, he's son of a painter, and they're very good, these Flemish painters. The other thing I should say, why are all these pictures done by people who aren't English? Why do you think? The Reformation. You haven't just destroyed 900,000 objects, you've destroyed the very idea of being an artist. There's no jobs anymore. The workshops are all destroyed. The skills have all been lost. There's a few commissions for royal portraits and things like that, but not many. And artists are so demoralized that when kings and queens do get round to saying, is anybody there? Can you paint a portrait of me? They're all crying in the corner. They won't paint it. They won't do anything for you. You have to get Marcus Gierarts and his son, or, you know, Van Dyck. It's not a coincidence. It all joins up. So they've stolen the power. So the royal portrait turns out to be a kind of history of the British art tradition as well. This fantastic high mannerist picture of all of England looking up Queen Elizabeth's skirt as she could. I mean, this would be a fantastic image for Peter de la Courte's point about control. She controls the nation. You bloody well not disobey what she wants. And there, the rainbow portrait. Look at her dress. Her dress is dung, 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 dung. It's eyes and ears. It is a reference to the Secret Service run by Robert Lord Cecil. She has the eyes and ears. Like what Caravaggio said about the tyrant of Dionysus, whose palace was built above the prison. He can hear everything that the people in his prison are saying, so he can catch all the people he hasn't yet caught. She's like that too. Again, the rainbow. I thought that was God's promise to mankind, but guess what? Turns out to be her promise to us. She has taken the power of God. This is how you do it. This is how, we might not be able to do much art, and it's not us doing it anyway, it's foreigners. What could be more British than being a foreigner? As Walter Sickert once said, I am Danish of pure Norwegian descent. Who could be more English than me? That's what she looked like. These things were distributed. The royal portrait was also, but then by extension, it became something, as some of these are actually, these pictures that are surrounding you, and that's how they come to be here, is that if a king or a queen on their procession through the country should happen to stop at your house, it'd have to be a big one. They're not going to stop at a garden shed. If they happen to stop at your house and you give them a particularly fine meal, they will then send a portrait or perhaps give you one there and then. There may be somebody with a whole stack of these tablets, these antique iPads with only one image on them that you see all around you. That this would be given by Elizabeth to one of her courtiers, or preferably someone like Francis Drake would commission it and wear it around his neck. And when Elizabeth said, "Who's that round your neck, Drake? Who's that round your neck?" he would open it. And if it was some other beautiful girl, it would be, "Right, Tower," but no, "Oh, no, no, it's you, it's you, it's you." Look behind it to see if there's another one. No, it's all right. So it became this kind of game, this courtly game, whereby, and Shakespeare's love sonnets very much introduce you to the sort of the coded world of Elizabethan love, which is partly to do with love, but also can be to do with calculation and realpolitik. Never trust. I don't know how she got that. Sorry. And then this is Charles I, by Van Dyck, with his the man who taught him how to ride horses. And this is the sort of Baroque, relaxed version of that very tightly controlled Elizabethan. It's a totally different style, but it's saying similar things. Charles I was the son of James I of England and the VI of Scotland, who instilled in him, there's a letter which still survives in the Royal Archives. He writes to him saying, "Remember always, my son, that you are to sit upon your throne like a little god, placed in power over other people. Remember that." And Charles always did remember it, which he remembered it almost too well. In fact, that was probably his main #1 problemo. But here he is, and Van Dyck makes this. You may have noticed it in Baroque portraits. If you notice that men in really brightly coloured drapery, like Pink satin in those days is like the most man thing. You know, it's a man world. And we are men and we are powerful. You express it through pink drapery or bright blue drapery. Color equals power. There are actually laws meaning that poor people can't wear these colors. If you're someone, you know, selling mussels on the streets of London and you're wearing the wrong color, you'll be arrested and put in jail. You can't wear pink. That's only for the knobs with an N. And the outthrust elbow, there's actually a deportment book published in, it's an Italian deportment book. So I read it when I was doing my work on Caravaggio, because Caravaggio and his mates used to go around Rome doing this a lot. And I always thought, why did they do that? So they're aping the manners of the aristocracy, even though they're only painters. And they're doing that. And what it signifies is your right to elbow any other out of the way, because you're better than them. So if you do that, so if you're on the tube and you do that, it's like saying I'm an aristocrat. The horse. Again, very few examples. What do you draw on if you're a royal portrait painter? You've only got back, you know, we're talking 1620s. You're only going back to 1480 for all portraiture, really, and then you're into the classical past. And guess what? There's a really fantastic example from the deep, deep classical past for you to borrow from. Rubens borrows from it before Van Dyck. Van Dyck's a student of Rubens. Rubens uses it for Olivares, who's the military commander for Spain. But Van Dyck uses it for Charles I. It's the statue of Marcus Aurelius on the Capitol, which is the most illustrious of all equestrian statues, the model for Donatello's Gattamelata, where the horse has balls the size of church bells, which again, the horse's genital equipment is a kind of metaphor for the commander's power and so on. But here, you know, Charles doesn't go in for anything as vulgar as having a horse with large testicles. You can't even see them. The point here is that he is another Roman emperor. And the horse, the man on top of a horse, is a very, very powerful, potent, royal symbol. And they used to practice this very particular form of equestrian control it was called the I can't remember the precise term for it. It's the Spanish school of equestrianism. And the best move of all is where you can get the horse to rear up on its hind legs while you're still in position. It's very difficult to do and it's uncomfortable for the horse. It's still part of the dressage routine in the Olympics, which is actually the only place where you can see the royal portrait performed as an Olympic event, because that is what they're doing in the dressage. It's about the aristocracy, the blue blood person on the blue blood thoroughbred, which is, the horse is also a symbol of their purity of breeding. Well, sorry, I mean, you can't be totally sure is what I mean to say. But ultimately, what it's saying is that, and Peter de la Court would have seen this very quickly, it's saying that the king on top of the horse, totally in control of the horse, is symbolizing his role as a king. And who is the horse? All of us, everybody. The horse is the nation. And it's our job to do exactly what he wants us to do with just even the slightest pressure of his knee. And the great center of all of Charles's propaganda, the place where these sorts of images and symbols were enacted most vividly, which in a way was a kind of performance art version of the royal portrait, was the banqueting hall, where these astonishingly elaborate court masks, court theatrical performances, played out by the entire court of Charles I and his queen, Henrietta Maria, all scripted by Ben Jonson and stage designed and embodied by Inigo Jones. So you would have, you know, scene one, a forest, And it's full of courtiers, and they've all been blacked up to look like, in quotes, savages, and they've got spears, and they represent the primitive world before civilization arrived in the, Stuart mindset. And then suddenly there would be an artificial flood of blue paper would sweep all those courtiers away. And then suddenly there would be a town and another town. And then there would be a war between the two towns, and all these other people would shoot spears, but they would be knights now and they'd be civilized. And then suddenly this huge chariot would come down from the ceiling of the banqueting house. And Henrietta Maria and Charles would get out, and they would go like that, and everybody would make peace. And then they would all dance around, and it would be an allegory of the fact that first there was barbarism, then there was civilization, then there was war, and there is the reign of Charles I and Henrietta Maria. And that would all happen, and it would cost about £14 million for one performance. And that was the same. And guess where they decided to cut Charles I's head off? In the banqueting house, the site of all of his royal propaganda. There he is again. Even more fantastically haughty. And when you understand the associations of this type of a question portraiture, you also understand why that extraordinary picture by George Stubbs, which now hangs at the very far end of the main enfilade of the National Gallery, Whistle Jacket, why that's such a fantastically politically subversive painting for the Whig aristocracy who commissioned it, who the Whig aristocracy are basically the aristocracy who are heir to the Glorious Revolution, to the world after Charles has been beheaded, after Charles II has reigned, but then his son has lost out in the Glorious Revolution. And from then on, who are we going to have as king? Well, there's no Protestants until you get to 117th in line, and he's a German, and he lives in a village in Hanover. Oh, well, then he's the King of England. George I, what? Come and be King of England. But I can't speak English. Okay, just come and be King of England. They can't speak English for several generations, but they're the kings. But of course, everybody knows they're not really people with power. They're not really people with power, and that's what the Whig aristocracy understand with perfection, and that's what that Stubbs painting is. It's a horse without a king on it. It's what Britain really is. Yes, we still have a monarchy, but just try subduing anybody if you are the king or queen. It's a different kind of thing that you are. We'll still call you the king, we'll still call you the queen, but just try doing anything meaningful and you will discover the limits of your power. And ever since that moment, he's the embodiment of everything that Peter de la Court hated. And in fact, he is, along with us and the Munsterites, the three of them were what brought the golden age of the Dutch to an end in 1672 in the great year of disaster. Here is Victoria. Very, very clever monarch. Victoria and Albert, they're sort of monarchs for an age of revolution, and they understand that this is the age of revolutions. Albert is educated by his mother explicitly to understand that although he may be, in effect, on the throne in Britain, there may well come the time, she tells him, when people don't sit on thrones anymore. So they know it. They understand it. And rather than lord it over their people, they present themselves to their people as though they are just slightly grander versions of themselves. And so what we get in the hands of Landseer is essentially the bourgeois royal portrait, the I'm like you royal portrait. Lots and lots and lots of children in a room that doesn't somehow seem that big with a garden behind. Well, it's a nice garden, okay. Most of us haven't got gardens that nice, but nonetheless, that's what's essentially going on. These are pictures of Albert by Victoria. I think what's very touching about what happens in the Albert-Victoria moment is the way in which, they love art, they make art. Albert's passion is art. He's the greatest, he's actually a much greater patron than Charles I, in my view. He is the single most extraordinary character in the cultural history of the British Isles, in terms of what he actually does, what he makes happen here. Think of all the museums that owe their existence to him. The whole, think of the V&A. I mean, it's astonishing what he managed to do. Albertopolis, they call it. in his day, and they were right to do so. But Victoria genuinely loved him. And there's something very beautiful about these portraits, because they're royal portraits like no other. They're actually, this is the, in the past, Henry VIII, say, would get Holbein to paint a picture of a prospective bride so that he could see what she was like, tell whether he, found her attractive and so on. But it's quite a cold exercise. Here, she's actually drawing him during their betrothal, during their courting time. She's drawing him in a long evening. They are genuinely in love. Look, there he is. Like she sees him as like, he's sexier than Byron. And I just love the way that they're so alert and alive to new media and new possibilities. I've got a great deal of time for Victoria and Albert. And Victoria, in this extraordinary sort of, they're quite morbid, but she loved her children when they were who doesn't, when they're that age between 2 and 4, when they're so sweet. And, they're so cuddly. And she actually got an artist to make casts, which then were carved in marble. It was a marble transfer, but it's essentially a cast made of marble of the hands and the feet of her little children when they were that age. So she could always have the memory of what it was like, to hold baby's foot, when baby was like, oh, my Mac, yeah. So it's still working. It's just that I flicked it off. Sorry. Right. So we entered the age of photography. But do you see what I mean? There's no lording it over anybody. There really. But there are these interesting moments when, particularly coronations, when you kind of need to have that, well, there's this feeling that you ought to have that old thing of what a king or a queen is. But it's a very ambivalent. I mean, when the Queen's coronation took place, I have to explain that in Westminster Abbey, there's one of the most amazing Cosmati style mosaic floors created in the 13th century. It's like the floor of the Sistine Chapel that Michelangelo was so in love with. It's made by the same people. It was a gift from Rome to Westminster, and there it is. And in the middle of it is this huge, semi-precious, I mean, goodness knows how much it would cost if you found such a thing today, but it would, gazillions. This huge circular piece of stone, which if you look in it, it's like looking into the cosmos, and that's bang in the middle. And every king and every queen of England has always been crowned directly sitting on top of that image of the cosmos. It's like Beam Me Up, Scotty, except it's the other way around. All of God's power is coming down through that sacred magic cosmos stone. And when Elizabeth got crowned, clearly the Church of England, being Anglicans and very bit dodgy anyway about anything superstitious. Being religious should be a bit superstitious, but no, not if you're an Anglican. Anyway, so they didn't want this, so they put this huge Axminster carpet on top of the whole Cosmati thing. So if you look at the TV coverage of the coronation of Elizabeth, she's sitting on the throne and it's on a carpet, but the throne is still directly on top of the stone. It's just that only those in the know it. So they still want the power. They still probably believe in the power. I imagine, I mean, you'll never know the conversations that take place, but I imagine that each one tells the next one, you've got the power. Nobody believes it. Don't try and use it, especially not if nuclear weapons are involved. But anyway, but you can sort of feel that suddenly when there's Cecil Beaton, this is Cecil Beaton's famous photograph. He's, look at the way that he's done that. It is, it's a little bit like the Elizabeth portraits. There's the numinous aura of magic and mystery hovering around her. Not in Andy Warhol. And not necessarily there, perhaps there too. It's quite a well-known picture. Just end with this one, which I think I mean, I can't say that I think it's the most fantastic portrait ever painted, but I do think it's very interesting that, as I began talking about, well, near the beginning of what I was saying, I was talking about how women have done monarchy better than men, in my experience, not in my experience, in my opinion, over the last several centuries. And these sort of this, I mean, she is definitely the boss in that picture, as far as I'm concerned. She's wearing a costume, a dress designed by Nick Cave's wife, Susie, the vampire's wife. You know, it's subtle, clever women's power dressing. It's you know, who's going to be the power behind the throne when he's on the throne? You know, I've got my own opinion. And that seems to me that's what the portrait is saying. It's doing something quite interesting in talking about the, you know, perhaps the history of royal gender politics. Anyway, I don't know. But anyway, that's the end of my highly controversial and slightly, in some places, fictional account of but I only ever exaggerate to make a point that's fundamentally and spiritually true. But that's the end of my reflection. So I'd be really grateful to be joined now by the two great artists who've made this work. And do you have a mic?
Yep, that's live and kicking.
So Dan's taken the mic, so Dan's going to have to start.
Thanks for that, Andrew.
No, you're welcome. Thank you. Thank you all.
Well, I'll just introduce how we came about putting this whole theme and format together. Adam invited me along to an event for London Art Week exactly a year ago, and neither of us really were aware of this wonderful collection Andrew's and Dominic suggested earlier. But more importantly, I mean, we felt that it was kind of a need in some ways to expand on it and sort of intervene and fill in some gaps, I think, where portraiture sort of dropped away, the depiction in all of those many hundreds of years ago. And, you know, whether or not they've still got a sort of role to play, if you like. And yes, in my particular depictions here, they're in the same garb as they would have been all those years ago. But I've kind of drawn some parallels with some contemporary figures that I've dropped in here and there. And in other cases, I've looked at how we can reinterpret these figures, or perhaps reinvent them, go down at the other trouser leg of history. So, for example, the Mary I here, I've taken a depiction of her as being this lady who is now a little bit more jolly. She's expecting a child in this depiction, and I'm sort of suggesting that her future looks a bit brighter. Although, you know, when you look at every depiction of Mary, they're always slightly grim and grisly, and you know, I think there's a sort of meanness in her face. But then when I was reading up about her and looking at what I could find, I sort of felt there was this other side to her, which was almost never kind of depicted, you know, particularly in the portrait. So in this sense, you know, sort of attempted to fill in the gap.
Are you trying to paint pictures of them as without having to wear the straitjacket of the royal portrait painter? So in other words, allowing yourself more freedom than you might have had if you'd been, you know, having to report to her directly.
Yeah, I think that's very much where we are at the moment. Really. I think that the whole role of the royal portraitist, or people who depict royalty, is to provide a perspective from the people rather than from the monarch. I mean, the monarch would have commissioned the portraits as propagandist pieces, as all of these would have been, as you were talking about earlier. But these days, we've had to search for a different role, I think, for it. I mean, if you look at photography now, it's completely taken over the whole canon. And for me, you go to the National Portrait Gallery, it's everywhere. It doesn't really say anything. It doesn't say anything about what the audience or the interjection of the individual. It's all about placement of the same stuff we would have seen since the Beaton picture. But painting can still occupy this special place where it delves into caricature, where it delves into the comparisons and exaggeration and all of those complex things. But in these pictures here, I've dressed them up in the same gear, really for theatrical purposes, really. But you know, and each one of them, I've taken them on different tangents.
Do you see them as a series of paintings that talk to each other, or are they standalone?
I see them as standalone as images, but as a collection, it's really about how the role of the portrait, I suppose, in depicting royalty, has to find its unique purpose. You know. So yeah, it's a collection, but I very much could isolate all of these, and they've got a completely different agenda. Some are very contemporary figures that are thrown into the gear of, say, Elizabeth Woodville there. You know, I've referenced Meghan Markle in that one, very obliquely. And it's really to do with the fact, you know, the irony, the great irony of this exiled figure, and her role now sort of still shouting from the margins, still commanding attention, the thorn in the side, you know, still there really for them. But, you know, where will it all go next? And that's what makes me very curious, is that you can play with these distant figures. You know, it was a bit of fun in some ways, but they provoke attention, they provoke discussion.
She reminds me a bit of Picasso's Weeping Woman. I don't know if that's just me or whether that was anything whatsoever in your mind. But that, yes, that sort of sense of somebody on the outside of things, very alone.
Yeah, and you know, again, my Welsh background sort of forced me really to kind of think about how the Welsh were depicted, the original kind of lineage of Welsh princes, the Tywysogs, before the imposed Prince of Wales. And this depiction here is of Llywelyn ap Gruffydd, who was about to be, he was deceived in this particular thing. He was about to have a deal with the English crown, in a peace pact. And then the poor bloke finds himself kind of captured, bound in ivy and decapitated with his head shown outside the house, you know, the tower. Do not do that again, sort of thing. So that was the end of the Welsh and the true lineage of the Welsh princes. But there was not a single, as far as I'm aware, not a single depiction, certainly no painted depictions of a Welsh prince. And you wonder, why is that? You know, why is there this huge gap? We don't have a visual culture really much beyond before. You'd say the Tudors, sort of, but nothing really before that whatsoever. You know, an effigy here or there, but that's about it.
Adam, what inspired you to take the approach that you've taken?
It's almost like diametrically opposite to Dan's approach. I mean, Dan's looked at the face of power and the visages confronting us. I've kind of delved more into the kind of apparatus behind power. And it's interesting that in your talk, you mentioned that kind of even authority has to appeal to authority. And in the collection here, they have a marvelous, I think it's 35-meter long chronicle of British monarchs called the Roll Chronicle, commissioned for Henry VI. And so maybe his subjects would have said, well, what makes you king? He said, well, my dad was king. He said, well, what about him? Well, his dad was king. And the Roll Chronicle in the collection here goes all the way back to Adam and Eve. So I have a drawing, which is my starting point for my series of drawings of origin myths of the City of London, you know, as the heart of empire, as the heart of British identity. Tower of London, where Bran the Blessed's head was buried to fend off invasion. But the drawing I have in the bar, which you can see afterwards, is my own chronology, informed by Geoffrey of Monmouth, the great pseudo-historian chronicler of British kings. And so I take Geoffrey of Monmouth's pseudo-history to show how Prince Harry, you can connect him all the way back to the god Zeus. That's his antecedent. And then further, back to chaos itself.
Yeah,
I quite like the idea that, yes, this lineage underpins not just the legitimacy of the monarchy, but also the identity of the British people. And there's a kind of, there's a rather quirky folk history to this, that summons up giants and pixies and, you know, Welsh figures from, you know, dragons. And Geoffrey of Monmouth, I mean, I wrote to some of the bona fide antiquaries to get their advice. Don't talk to me about Geoffrey of Monmouth. And it's because it's very much, you know, it's the opposite of what antiquaries are supposed to do. Antiquaries, they write about history by studying objects. They're, you know, empiricist, and they look and they don't speculate. It's all very, very scientific. So what I was proposing was the complete opposite of what they do, and I think it got up some people's noses. But then at the same time, when I looked through the collection to find, so I constructed these drawings from objects in the collection, like a visual encyclopedia. So if I needed to depict the raven that was Bran's symbol and was the progenitor of Charles I, deciding it would be a good idea to bring back ravens to the Tower to protect London and thereby Britain. So I think it was originally Charles I had 6 ravens and 1 for luck stuck in a tower. But so in the collection, it's full of crazy, you know, figures from mythology. I mean, there are dragons in the collection. So explain that, antiquaries. Just I'm into the storytelling and the way that you know, Londoners identify themselves through their stories and their connections to the past, whether they arrived yesterday or whether they've been here for generations. So quickly, the story.
I mean, I suppose a royal mythographer, sort of people who were creating exactly these kinds of origin myths for the court of Elizabeth. I mean, you could describe those people as, you know, antiquaries, you know, working for Stalin. You know, you'll only find this out about history. Thank you very much. And you're going to do a lot of really interesting research, but what you're going to find is this. Yeah. At the end of all your research, you're going to definitely find this.
I mean, Dr. Goebbels was a great, you know, proponent of this, connecting your chosen project with particular myths. There's a very uncomfortable aspect to it. I think there are aspects of nationalism, like we couldn't possibly have been descended from these ghastly people who just wandered over Doggerland or whatever. We must be the inheritors of Troy, which is what Geoffrey of Monmouth's project was.
Yes, yes, exactly. Well, that's why I've always liked the Sickert quote about being Danish and Norwegian. You could be more English or British.
When really we should be the descendants of giants who were apparently living here, according to Geoffrey of Monmouth.
Well, yes.
Before Brutus showed up at Totnessium, killed them all except for Gog and Magog, who still guard the Guildhall, and they're by the Lord Mayor, the kind of novelty king of Britain.
Were you making your work in response to everything, as it were, in the Society of Antiquaries, or were you making it in response to the very idea of the Society of Antiquaries, or were you making it in response to the paintings in this show? Not the latter, I think.
I think the way it's more a case of my using the Society of Antiquaries collection as a resource to create a visual tableau that accompanied you know, pre-existing texts.
Yeah, but in a way analogous to what Grace and Perry did at the British Museum.
Yes,
like quite a few years ago.
But I mean, when I make a lot of maps, and that involves using archives across the whole of the capital and Britain. But just weirdly, I just never used the Society of Antiquaries before.
But it seems to me like it's a really good cross-fertilization, is that your work could take one into the Society of Antiquaries much more, you know, or could lead to an interest in something that perhaps one hadn't even known existed.
Exactly. I think everyone gathered here this evening, you know, could find this out for themselves by paying, is it 60 quid to be an affiliate? And,
you know, there we are. That's a please join here.
But I think Dan's idea was great because, you know, it might lead on to other artists hearing about this and wanting to engage with the Society of Antiquaries as, I can't describe it as quirky, but it's not like any other archive I've worked in. There doesn't seem to be any logic to it, except that it's a resource by which we understand the past, by which antiquaries understand the past.
Some of the best places, well, unfortunately, Strawberry Hill, which was once a kind of antiquaries treasure trove, that would be antiquarianism in action if you could go back there with everything everywhere. But there is still one place, I think, where I would say it's like the ultimate antiquaries antiquarianism as art, which would be the Sir John Soane Museum. Because, you know, what did Robert Harbison once said? It's a house that's like the model. It's a house that's like the chambers of a person's mind.
Yes.
So the downstairs is the subconscious, you know, upstairs is the superego.
Yes.
You know, there's the id. Over there, where's the amygdala? Ah! Oh, fallen down the stairs again. But it's great. It's wonderful the way you've responded to it. And were you, what I don't quite understand is when you decided to do your paintings, had this exhibition already been planned, or was the whole thing almost a sort of symbiotic event where you wanted to do the paintings and the exhibition happened as a result of that as well as that?
Well, at the time, and as a long-standing interest, is this depiction of these historical figures. Take, for example, going back to Blake. Blake did it with these portraits of these heads that he reimagined. He was so desperate to put a face to these figures of the past.
No, absolutely.
And he did a whole series of them, the visionary heads or something they were called. And it's something that I've always been interested in doing. So this was a kind of another sort of push towards it. And then, of course, having this access was another point to kind of propel me along, I suppose. But I've got a long-standing interest in these characters of the past, and you know, a bit like what the whole Renaissance is about. It's about digging, you know, revisiting some of these figures, and the art and the depictions in between, and repurposing them, refashioning them for an age now where I think they still have a great lot to talk about. You know, not just in the people themselves, but how we use the medium of paint to tell the story. Because I think we're kind of, you know, walking in slightly in terms of what painting is. We've always got to keep it in check. And the problem right now, as far as I see it, is that it's kind of still playing, you know, the poor relation to the photograph, and it can't quite get out of that.
It's quite timely though, because it seems to me that there is maybe it's because of my, you know, me being who I am, as it were, and taking the interest that I do. But it seems to me that it's not just me, that people are genuinely interested in the subject of royal portraiture at the moment. There's been quite a strong response to that picture I showed of William and Kate, and there has to Jonathan Yeo's, you know, what do we call it, the pink portrait of Charles III. It seems to me that people are perhaps more interested in these images and the possibilities that they hold than they are in the sort of increasingly relentlessly tedious world that everybody seems to inhabit.
But they're on the money
of photographs.
Well, I mean, I think what they definitely do is they stimulate the debate, and you need to have a help the debate about the role of painting, depictions of portraiture in you know, in, should we say, in the popular media. I mean, you know, I've fallen prey to it. I've kind of do my damnedest to avert and avoid any kind of commentary. But you've got to be single-minded and sort of, you know, bloody-minded about the way you want to tell that story, and work out your own kind of corner for it. I think. I mean, you know, yeah, you're right. I think that there's been lately a whole load of them. These portraits have come out, and they get a huge amount of attention. And it's, I mean, it's wonderful to see that actually happens with paintings.
Yeah, it is. I would have thought it would carry on as well, because painting becomes increasingly a kind of unfamiliar country. It sort of becomes more and more like going somewhere else, because of the amount of time people spend in the virtual reality that they do it now. I think this might be a good time, perhaps, if you guys agree, to open, because we said we'd open up the questions. I mean, we don't want to stick too much to the plan, because then people might think we knew what we were doing. But if anyone has a question for anybody here, please raise your hand.
May I have a go? I think the finest example of art legitimizing kings and the line of kings was at Holyrood Palace up in Edinburgh, where they had 2 huge rooms filled with all of the kings going back to ancient Egypt. And they all look the same. They're all painted by the same person. And they went back to Scotia, who was an Egyptian priest priestess and queen who gave her name to Scotland, of course. And they all mysteriously disappeared as soon as Alex Salmond became First Minister.
No comment, but I mean, yeah, absolutely. It is a mystery. Where did they go?
Thank you very much. I've got a fun fact and then a question for you. And the fact is what I understand about the Mantegna pictures that you can see, the fresco of Julius Caesar, which is in Hampton Court Palace, which was bought by Charles I, was part of his royal collection. And after he lost the Civil War, the parliamentarians sold almost all of it off. But it is said that Oliver Cromwell thought, fresco of a heroic military leader who saves the Republic. I think we need to hold on to those, boys. We'll put those to one side and flog the rest. But the question is, and I very much enjoyed your survey of royal portraiture. How would you fit Cromwell's self-portraiture into that? Is that consistent with as sort of another iteration of manifestations of power, or is it different?
No, I mean, Cromwell, I mean, I know that story about Mantegna, and I'm sure it's right, because he did sell everything else. But I think essentially Cromwell he didn't want to relate himself, I think, dynastically. He knew that was in no way feasible or possible. He's not saying I'm the new king. He's saying there's a right. It's like he's like Brutus in Julius Caesar, saying, you know, it's gone, it's finished. I'm the right way to do things. So I'll have this picture. It's not even a portrait of me. I mean, it's a very telling act. It's not a portrait of me. It sort of bears. It's like if you look at Paradise Lost in relationship to the court mask, you could say that the character of Satan, who's essentially a stage artificer, he's a sort of Inigo Jones. He's always putting on fantastic shows which turn out to have absolutely no substance and are appallingly immoral and totally lacking in ethics and represent a great sort of Promethean rage against God. You know, that in a sense, Cromwell is saying, well, instead of all those Stuart masks, here, this sort of solemn frieze, perfect virtue, painted by an Italian artist I'd never heard of until I came into this palace. But that's perfect, that'll do me, because it represents classical virtue, and that's what we're all about. And it's a sort of Puritan anti-portraiture, I think. What Cromwell did in terms of his actual portraits, I don't know. But I suspect one could find it. Well, yeah, exactly, which is like, it's saying, it's not quite, but it's, you know, what did Voltaire said, no emperor, any emperor, no matter how great, is always forever and only seated on his own arse. So it's a bit like that. It's like saying, well, I don't believe in the divine right of kings. I don't believe that I'm anointed. What I believe in is virtue and being yourself. It's very Puritan. You find the same values expressed actually weirdly in Jane Austen's novels. You put on plays, you're a bad person. And if you run around, you know, trying to have sex with lots of people, you're a bad person. If you're just yourself and you're happy, or even if you're unhappy, virtue is essentially inactive and unchangeable, immutable. That's the Puritan view. I prefer the novel to theatre because novels about interior reflection. It's a form of prayer, if you're Jane Austen.
Thank you very much for a wonderful overview of royal portraiture and your discussion afterwards. It's fascinating. It's particularly pertinent for me because I'm a master's student at the University of Buckingham, undertaking the Masters in the History of Collecting. And my dissertation is going to hopefully be concentrating on British royal portraits in the medium of reverse glass painting. And this is because of some discoveries that I've made of reverse glass portraits from India to Brighton, to China. And one particular portrait, they're all very interesting, may have many layers of meanings, but one of them actually resides in a Scottish castle. It's taken, you can see as soon as you walk into the room, you can see, you will say, that is the head of Charles I by Van Dyck. And he's got the blue sash of the Garter as well. And then you look at it and you realize that there's something not quite right about this portrait. It's a very good portrait, naturalistic. And it turns out, if you look closely, that is a reverse glass painting of Charles I. And it was brought back by a Scottish, probably British or Swedish East India Company supercargo in 1750. And he had it commissioned. But the interesting thing there is that although people were bringing back these sorts of things for, for the Western market, the chap who commissioned this portrait, it appears that he was a great fan of absolutist monarchy. And of course, it also makes me think about Charles I, a cult of the martyr. And the family's motto is, I shine, not burn. So he may have chosen the medium of reverse glass portraiture because of its particularly crystalline, luminous qualities. So I'm just wondering if you can talk a bit more about the importance of materials.
How big are they?
The Charles I is, it's just a standard, it's probably the size of Elizabeth Woodville over there. A lot of them, reverse glass portraits, were similar size. They were taken obviously from either prints or miniatures, but the Chinese artisans were particularly skilled and they literally paint back to front. And the wonderful thing is that although the glass might degrade, the colours absolutely pop today. They are as vibrant as they were 250 years ago.
Goodness. I don't think I've ever seen such a thing. Have you? Reverse glass. How does it work? What's reverse? Is it reversed because it's...
It's reversed. They paint in reverse. The artist scrapes off some of the silvering and they paint the eyes and little features first, and then they paint the outline. And the one of Charles I is fantastic. I can show you the picture afterwards. You would think, it was, it's very, very naturalistic. But then the image, of course, can get transformed for different cultures. So, for example, one I found of George IV, which resides in a glass room, Ashish Mahal in India, has been completely transformed for, is like a chubby Indian-looking George. But reverse glass painting is a particular medium, so that's why I was interested when you said about painting telling the story, because the materials, it's the mystery, those mysterious materials are telling the story.
Sounds like that. We should have an exhibition here.
Thanks. Thank you for a wonderful talk. I just wondered if you could give us any insight into the selection of royal artists and the risks that the monarch might take in selecting one and the end product.
What do we think?
Well, I think these days, when a monarch, the monarch doesn't commission themselves. They're commissioned by an organisation or the place of which they're a patron of, you know. So in the case when I did my commission, it was with the Welsh Rugby Union, believe it or not, and she had been the patron of them since her coronation, you know. But they don't stipulate anything really. I had an opportunity to go and look at her wardrobe and choose the dress, and I, you know, definitely didn't want to do that. But you know, then she elected what to wear, but they don't tell you anything about. Perhaps you might indicate something to do with, you know, this part of her life, or, you know, how much she loves Wales, or there's none of that. I mean, I didn't even know my passport when I turned up at the gate, so it barely, you know, almost never happened. But there's a great informality of it. But I think the paintings there and the photographs that Andrew's picked up on, I think there would have been a very stiff, kind of rigid agenda and directive, if you like, you know, from the monarch. And I wouldn't, you wouldn't want to be around then, I think, you know. But you know, Holbein did it, and he worked between, you know, very freely and fluidly between the whole court and all the employees of the court, and did a wonderful job of it. But he must have been an incredibly skilled sort of diplomat to do that. I mean, still gobsmacked how he managed to do it. You know, come back with that portrait of is the Danish, the one he's commissioned the first.
Anne of Denmark.
Yeah, Anne of Denmark came back, and you know, he said no thanks at the end. He basically was duped by Holbein into thinking she was as beautiful as the painting was, but then when he saw her in life, you know, he definitely didn't take to her. So.
How long did you spend with the Queen?
Sort of amounted to about half a day, I suppose. Yeah, it was sort of.
That's a lot of commitment from the monarch to the Welsh Rugby Union, in a way, isn't it? I mean, it's like saying, yes, you know. I'm not a figurehead. It's like this is real, in a way. That's what it. I mean, that's one of the things that's marked by a picture of that kind, and by the fact that she does do a sitting. It's not based on because there might be people who'd think he must have done that based on a photograph. Or
no, well, I think
she couldn't possibly give that time.
No,
you know, to a real painter, could she?
No, that's right. No, and I think, well, you know, Freud, she probably did the longest known sitting of a life to Lucian Freud's.
How long was that?
Well, it was over a long period of time, and he basically laid out he stipulated what he wanted. It was a kind of unprecedented thing. You know, she was to come to him, and you know, she was to wear the same gear, and I think he really pushed. I think, you know. So in that relationship, we can see how the dynamic has changed, you know. But yeah, it was the best part half a day, and you know, she talks about everything under the sun. You know, you sign a very strict secrecy act. You're told, you know, the wink that do not, you know, all this has been recorded, and if anything gets out here, look out. You know? And rightly so. She loves the unchoreographed thing of it. You know, I think that you could see that she really enjoyed it.
Yeah,
and that was necessary to get the image, actually, because I was trying to keep her off. You know, it was a bit of a sword fight, because I was attempting to get her off guard. I mean, I was drawing at an easel in front of me, but I wasn't really doing much, just fiddling around. And then trying to keep her engaged in a conversation and get an off guard moment, you know, because she's so used to the eye on the camera and how the.
How do you capture the off guard moment?
Well, I had a very brief, I had literally about 2 or 3 frames, which were principally from the camera, but. You know, I had to be in that room to get those gestures. Of course, there were gestures. You know, there was the fiddling and the fidgeting and the kind of.
So you were, in a sense, using the camera as a notebook.
Yeah,
because Holbein's would have 2-3 hours, I imagine.
No, absolutely.
To do those amazing pencil portraits.
No, indeed.
Of each person, and that was his drawing was his camera, and he only just did that.
Yeah, yeah.
In some ways, the drawings Holbein, I think, are more
I agree with you.
Amazing. You know, those the ones that are all in the Royal Collection. Now, probably the greatest portraits I think I've ever seen. If you see them collectively, it's mind-boggling, really.
Absolutely, and that show that's just been at the Queen's Gallery, exceptional, and lucky we have it all here, you know, to enjoy it. It's
interestingly, I think they're Charles's favourite things.
Yeah, I can see why. Yeah.
There's a.
One really for Adam and Dan. It's interesting what faces sort of reside in the national psyche and some which don't. So, you know, most of us have some idea what Disraeli looked like. Probably most people can't really picture what Salisbury looked like. We all think we know what Victoria looked like. George II, you know, probably less so. Right, so is it more interesting to be working on or with images of people whose facial characteristics are less known to people in 2024?
Good question.
That is a good question. There were archetypes for Brutus that people like Inigo Jones and Ben Jonson would have used when they were creating their masks. But then you go, because everything's up for grabs, but then you'll have one skillful engraver who's like created the archetype that gets circulated around the intelligentsia in the same way that coins were circulated across the nation. And I think people, they would recognize their monarch from a coin before anything else. And then there's a period where the coins are actual portraits of the monarch. I forget which one it would be the first, probably one of the Henrys. Henry VII, yes. So before that, you just had a generic image of a king on the coin. So my particular interest in creating these images was to use archetypes or to find, because there aren't that many, there's not much imagery connected with Geoffrey of Monmouth's retelling of the stories of the British monarchs, but there are, you know, bits and pieces. So in a way, the recognizability of the characters that you're speaking about in your question would connect the contemporary viewer with something in an antiquaries collection. Does that make sense? So I mean, I'm interested in archetypes.
Yeah, I'd similarly, my depiction of Athelstan here directly relates to that picture behind. And the picture behind, as Dominic suggests, was saved from a burning house. But it would have been commissioned hundreds of years after Athelstan was alive.
Yeah.
Now, first of all, why did that person commission it, right? Then, where on earth where are they getting this image and depictions from? And they would have been doing the same digging around as we might do here, you know, to find out the details of perhaps the crown, scepter, sort of, you know, all the paraphernalia around. But you know, they're no better off than we are, really.
No, I mean,
they're none the wiser. But because they got there first with the depiction, that becomes the assumed currency of their image, you know. So we have to build on that, and you can't kind of say, oh well, I'm just starting again. No, I'm not bothering with that. I'm going to start completely carte blanche and go for my own sort of version of events.
Iconographical artists are quite lazy. I mean, Cesare Reaper, once he codified all the signs and symbols, I mean, you know, that's what fame looks like. She's holding a trumpet and a book. That's what fame looks like. And, you know, why mess with it? You know, it's got enough problems. I'm trying to paint chiaroscuro. Fine, at least fame, I know what she looks like. But it is true, once somebody does something. But I was thinking about that precedent, that idea about how kings were portrayed, or, you know, this idea of the full-face portrait I was talking about earlier. Equally important is the profile portrait. So which became a huge cult in the early period of Italian portraiture. So Sigismondo Malatesta, for example, or who's the main guy in Urbino, you know, Montefeltro. They have themselves depicted in profile because the association is with Roman emperors from the very earliest coins. So to have yourself done in profile it's almost like Cromwell wanting to be associated with the Mantegna, Caesar, like saying, well, I am Caesar. And a lot of them were basically bully boy mercenaries, heads of armies in the patchwork of Italy. So, you know, you're going to elevate yourself by saying you're an emperor. You're not an emperor, you're a bit of a thug. But
like a Napoleon.
Well, yeah, I mean, but he sort of, yes, yeah, I mean, he probably does enough to be regarded as an emperor. But I mean, you don't necessarily, you know, approve of it at the same time, but there's definitely what he counts as.
But this gentleman's question also, I think, it relates to the world of caricature, where you'll see an English newspaper, King Charles, when he was Prince Charles, big ears, slopey nose. And as a nation, we'd recognize that caricature of our king. I once went to, have you been to Tirana? I went to the Albanian National Gallery, had this room full of hideous clay caricature portraits of significant figures from the West, who the patriotic Albanians were supposed to ridicule. And it took a long time to work out who these people were, because their idea of caricature didn't tally with our idea of newspaper caricatures of whoever. So it took a long time for me to work out they were supposed to be Marilyn Monroe and not.
I mean, it is one of the. I was at the National Portrait Gallery the other day and was wandering about, and that is one of the innate. When you come to the lesser known figures, you say, well, most people know what Disraeli looks like, but can I think really what Palmerston? Oh, Palmerston looked like that. That's interesting. It's almost worth going to the museum just for that. It's like, oh, right.
Always visit the waxworks in strange capital cities. My tip. Well, you won't be
Antiquarian's tip of the
Yes.
week. Well, can I borrow the? Oh no, I don't need the mic, do I? I'm already mic'd. I think we've drawn to a natural conclusion, and in my experience, few audiences, no matter how hardy, can really take more than an hour and 20 minutes of this type of conversation. So I'm going to, introduce the man who will bring it to a close.
Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm thank you to our panel. Fantastic evening. Just to remind you, as Dan gave a fantastic plug for affiliate membership, you're very welcome to pick up a leaflet on affiliate membership on the way out. Tomorrow night, we have our gala auction. So there would be two engraving prints from our collections, which we will auction. And there'll be 2 works from Adams and 2 works from Dan, so 6 in total. And Matthew Haley from Bonhams and Antiques Roadshow will hold the auction. And you'll have a catalogue on your laps, which will show the online auction, which closes at 6 o'clock on Friday. And the objective is to raise money to hire a cataloguer to get those William Blakes online so that we can share them with the rest of the world. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan. Yeah, thank you very much.